Ronnie LeeRoy Yarbrough was born on September 17th, 1938 at Jacksonville, Florida. LeeRoy was one of 6 kids that grew up in the blue-collar side of town of Timminsville, South Carolina. His passion was always working on and racing race cars. In his early days in stock cars, LeeRoy Yarbrough grew up on the west side of Jacksonville, Florida, and developed a need for speed at an early age. LeeRoy Yarbrough found his way to a local dirt track and eventually won at Jacksonville at the age of 19 in the spring of 1957. Yarbrough started his career in the Sportsman Series. After winning 11 races, LeeRoy Yarbrough moved up to the most powerful modifieds and won 83 features in a 3-year span. Yarbrough won 2 short track races in the 1964 NASCAR Grand National season. The first year he competed in more than 14 races. 2 years later, LeeRoy Yarbrough scored his first superspeedway race win at Charlotte by leading 450 of the 500 miles at Charlotte. LeeRoy was driving an unsponsored and lightly regarded Dodge Charger owned by John Thorne. And then in 1968, he was driving for Junior Johnson-owned Ford team. Unfortunately, they started out poorly early in the season. However, LeeRoy Yarbrough eventually rebounded and won 2 races at Atlanta and Trenton. In 26 starts in his 1968 seasons, LeeRoy Yarbrough earned 2 wins, 15 top 5s, 16 top 10s, 6 poles, and an average finish of 12.1. But the next year for him gets better for him. 1969 was the best season LeeRoy Yarbrough has ever had in his entire NASCAR career. His season started off with a bang by winning the 1969 Daytona 500 by beating Charlie Glotzback on a last lap pass. And then he got his second win of the season at the Rebel 400 at Darlington. But he got into the crash with Bobby Allison. And luckily for him, he was 1 lap ahead of everybody. So he was the only car on the lead lap. So he manages to crab walk to victory. How about that? That's an underrated finish right there, folks. And then he got his 3rd win of 1969 at the World 600 at Charlotte. And then LeeRoy Yarbrough got his 4th win of 1969, leading 96 out of 160 laps. And that also meant he swept the Daytona races of 1969. He got his 5th win of 1969 at Atlanta for the running of the Dixie 500. And then he got a 6th win of 1969 by making a last lap pass on David Pearson at Darlington for the 1969 Southern 500. And LeeRoy Yarbrough got a 7th and final win in 1969 at Rockingham for the 1969 American 500. What a big year for LeeRoy. His 1969 stats are 7 wins, 16 top 5s, 21 top 10s, and an average finish of 8.9. He ran 30 races in 1969 because back then it was common to race like 40 or 50 something races a year. But unfortunately in 1970, that year was a turning point of his life. On the April of 1970, LeeRoy Yarbrough suffered a hard testing crash at the Texas World Speedway in College Station, Texas. That crash left him disoriented. He was so disoriented he could not remember fellow driver Cale Yarbrough, no relation by the way, picking him up in Texas a few days later and flying him home. He also couldn't remember flying to and racing at Martinsville. Junior Johnson, who considered him the best driver he ever had, was determined to find out what was wrong. He said, quote, "He could remember everything from 1970 and back, nothing forward," end quote, Johnson said. He also mentioned about how when he goes to dinner, they'd put a plate in front of him. He would just sit there until he was told to eat his food. Then he would pick up his knife and fork and ate his food. On the racing side, he did 19 races and only won a race. With 8 top 5s, 11 top 10s, 1 pole, and an average finish of 13.8, LeeRoy Yarbrough won the 1970 National 500 at Charlotte, which would be his last ever NASCAR win. He made 24 more starts between 1971 and 1972. LeeRoy Yarbrough missed the 1973 Daytona 500 and made no NASCAR starts ever since then. However, on the IndyCar side of his career, he competed in the Indianapolis 500 3 times in 1967, 1969, and 1970 for Jim Robinson. His best finish at an Indy 500 was 19th in 1970. He made two more IndyCar starts, one race at Ontario where he finished 8th at, and then he made his last ever IndyCar start at Trenton. He finished third at that race. As his racing career ended, his health was an issue once again. He was rumored to have contracted Rocky Mountain spotted fever from a tick bite, and he also drank heavily. He most likely suffered brain trauma in Texas and Indy. On March 7th, 1980, LeeRoy Yarbrough was committed to a Florida State hospital at Chattahoochee by Judge Hudson Olive of Jacksonville after he was tried for attempted first-degree murder of his mother and battery to a law enforcement officer. His mother, Minnie Yarbrough, testified that he had walked up to her and strangled her for no reason. Judge Olive ruled that Yarbrough was not guilty of attempted murder because he was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the incident. On December 6, 1984, LeeRoy Yarbrough was rushed to Jacksonville's University Hospital after he had a violent seizure and fell over, striking his head and fell unconscious immediately. On the next day of December 7th, 1984, LeeRoy Yarbrough passed away due to internal brain injuries caused by the fall, which meant he had internal bleeding in the brain. LeeRoy became the first driver to win NASCAR's Triple Crown races in 1969. He was named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers in 1998. I forgot to mention earlier in the video that he also punched Bill France Sr. during the 1969 Talladega controversy. Junior Johnson said about LeeRoy, quote, "LeeRoy had the most raw talent I've ever seen," end quote. Personally, he's Hall of Fame worthy from his accomplishments. If he's not in the Hall of Fame, then he really deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Throughout his NASCAR Cup Series career, he raced 198 races, he won 14 races, he earned 65 top 5s, 92 top 10s, 10 poles, and an average finish of 15.0, and he only had 8 DNQs. LeeRoy Yarbrough was 46 years old.